Hello, everyone, and welcome to Public Professor Series at Home. I'm very pleased to welcome you all today. My name is Elizabeth Galway, and I'm an Associate Professor of English at the University of Lethbridge, where I am also a Director of the Institute for Child and Youth Studies. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Goldie Morgentaler. Goldie Morgentaler is Professor of English at the University of Lethbridge, where she teaches classes on 19th century British and American literature. She holds an undergraduate degree from Bennington College in Vermont, as well as an MA and PhD from McGill University in her hometown of Montreal. She is the author of a book on Charles Dickens titled Dickens and Heredity, and the author of numerous articles on Dickens and Victorian literature. She is past president of the Dickens Society and currently serves on the editorial board for the Dickens Quarterly. She is also the translator from Yiddish to English of much of Hava Rosenfarb's work, including her epic Holocaust novel, The Tree of Life, a trilogy of life in the Lodz Ghetto. Her translations have won several awards, including a Canadian Jewish Book Award and the prestigious Modern Languages Association's Prize for Yiddish Studies for the translation of Rosenfarb's short story collection, Survivors. She is also the editor of Rosenfarb's poetry collection, Exile at Last. In 2019, Dr. Morgentaler was awarded a Canadian Jewish Literary Prize for a collection of essays by Rosenfarb entitled Confessions of a Yiddish Writer. Hava Rosenfarb also received an honorary degree from the University of Lethbridge in 2006 and gave a remarkably moving and memorable convocation address, which is available online, and I encourage you all to take a look at that. Since beginning my career at the University of Lethbridge, I've had the very good fortune to have Goldie as my colleague in the English department. She's been a wonderful mentor, a terrific friend, and it's wonderful to have somebody that I can discuss 19th century literature with, who shares my passion, even though we don't always agree, but we always have great conversations about it. Goldie gave a superb public professor lecture in November 2016 titled How Dickens Invented Christmas and Why It Matters. And today I'm going to ask her a few questions about her research. When you gave your public professor talk in November 2016, you spoke about how you came to love Dickens, and then you focused more specifically on A Christmas Carol, which is arguably his best known work, even if I personally like Great Expectations and choose that as my favorite. But I wanted to ask you how your research has evolved since giving that talk. And I'm curious to know what aspects of Dickens you're looking at now, and whether you think he is in fact still relevant today.
Elizabeth, before I answer the question, I want to thank you for that. That's a lovely introduction. I was not quite expecting that, and I found it very moving. To get back to Dickens, when I gave my public professor talk on the Christmas Carol, there were a number of aspects of that work that struck me. I mean, working on Dickens is a little bit like swimming in the sea. There is so much, and there's so many possible topics that one could do research on. So I actually got two out of that particular talk. Two things struck me. The first one was right in the middle of A Christmas Carol, there's a description of Belle and her many, many children. And Dickens goes out of his way to underline how the difference between breeding in the sense of reproduction of human biology and the warmth and the kind of generosity that's implied by that, and Scrooge's kind of breeding, which is sterile, and he's breeding money from money. But in order to get that kind of raucous atmosphere, you need to have many children. And I started to wonder, all of Dickens's novels contain large families. And I started to wonder if he changes in his depiction of those families, and if so, why? And what that actually means. It's true that the Victorians in general had a lot of children because it didn't, birth control was really not something they understood very well. I think rubber doesn't get vulcanized until the 1850s. So you had condoms that didn't work. It's not that people didn't want to control their families, but they really didn't know how very well. So I started to look at that in his works, and I guess my theory was that the earlier works, you have a lot of large families with many children, um, and Dickens approves. And A Christmas Carol isn't the only place where he puts, sort of juxtaposes the large families, the overwhelmingness of human breeding with a kind of cold atmosphere. For instance, he does it in Dombey and Son a lot. And there are large families in almost all the novels. I mean, there's a reason why Dickens was known as the novel of the domestic hearth. But as you get into the later works, there are fewer and fewer large families. And those that there are not depicted as particularly, they're certainly raucous enough, but that's no longer a positive value. And so my hypothesis was that this was a reflection of Dickens's own life, because he himself came from a family of about 8 children, his wife from a similarly large family, and then he and his wife together had 10 children, of whom 9 grew to adulthood. And as time went on, Dickens blamed his wife for all her births, because he felt it was, he didn't want to have that many children, and he felt it was a burden on him to keep supporting them. And so part of what I was arguing was that, in fact, that's why, as you go further and further into his work and get to the later period, that's why there are fewer families of large children. But even when they exist, and I guess the most famous or infamous one is Mrs. Jellyby and her brood in Bleak House, the depiction is no longer positive. There's quite an obvious change. And the change is that it's the mother who is responsible for the fact, A, that there's so many children, and B, that they're not well behaved, and they're in constant danger of being neglected, of falling into each other, of being run over. And you get a similar portrait in Great Expectations with Mrs. Pocket and her brood. So that led me to researching some of the 19th century attitudes towards reproduction and birth control. And it was quite interesting to me to find that, contrary to common belief, first of all, abortion was quite common. Not always successful, but there were all kinds of drugs that women could take. And women in particular were very anxious to space their children. And you can see why. Dickens's wife, part of the reason that marriage fell apart was because Mrs. Dickens was pregnant. She had 10 children. She was pregnant about 12 years in the first few years of their marriage. And she was worn out by the end. So Dickens, however, never really realized the toll that that kind of fertility could take on women. And it's not in any of his novels. And on the contrary, what's in the novels is the toll that large families take on men, because they have to work to support the children. There's a wonderful scene in Great Expectations where the father of this large family is constantly picking himself up by the hair in just utter frustration at having such a large family. So the whole issue of fertility and reproduction, I got very interested in that. And I just published an essay on that. The other topic that came out of my presentation on A Christmas Carol, and that I gave a paper on, is the issue of noise and the chaos that is associated with large families. Because if you have a lot of children, you better get used to the idea you're going to have a lot of noise and a lot of running around. And what struck me there is that Dickens was obsessive compulsive. He was a neatness freak. He insisted that there's a right place for everything and everything in its place. So with his children, he would check their clothes drawers every day to make sure that all the clothing was there neatly arranged. And if it wasn't, he would leave the child a note saying, you know, you better fix this. Something was sticking out of your shirt or whatever. He insisted that everybody come to dinner pronto, on the dot, and he would get upset if the children were late to show up for dinner. If he went out for a walk and the wind mussed his hair, he would go into the closest place he could find and comb it. He was really an obsessive about order, about neatness. And the paradox that interested me was how this obsessive compulsive personality could write such amazing descriptions of chaos, and especially the chaos associated with mobs, as in Barnaby Rudge, one of his lesser known novels that deals with uprising in London. And some of those descriptions are incredible. Similarly, in A Tale of Two Cities with the French Revolution, you get the feeling of this mob, this frightening group of people who are out of control. And at the same time, the way he describes them is so full of detail, as if he himself had been part of a mob. And I think he had a horrified fascination for mobs, for disorder, any kind of disorder. I mean, he does very well with the children in Bleak House who are tumbling all over the place, he says. So that I thought that was really a very interesting kind of paradox, because in truth, if you're going to be writing about a mob and describing it, you can't do it. There's no simultaneity, right? You have to, this happened and then that happened and then that happened. So in a sense, what you're doing is you put order to the mob. And I think that's why there are so many descriptions of people in groups and people out of control, usually when they're in groups. So that was another thing. I haven't worked that into a paper, into an essay yet, but I was very interested in that. And the most recent thing I'm working on now has nothing to do with A Christmas Carol. It actually grows out of something else. And it's about the Franklin expedition and the role that Dickens played in denying one of the explorers, a man whose name was John Ray, who actually went and found out what happened to the Franklin expedition. As you may know, the Franklin set off from England to look for the Northwest Passage. He had two boats. I forget how many sailors were on them, and they never came back. And nobody knew what happened to them. And eventually, John Franklin's wife and the Admiralty started sending out expeditions to the Arctic, to the Canadian Arctic, to find out what happened. And one of the explorers that they sent out was a man called John Ray, who was from the Orkney Islands. And he turns out to have been an extraordinary explorer. He explored large parts of Canada. In some books, he's credited with actually finding the Northwest Passage. One of the reasons he was so successful was because, unlike the other British explorers, he realized that in order to get anywhere in the Arctic in such terribly harsh conditions, it would help to get to know the Inuit and to learn from them. And so he established relationships with them. And because of these relationships, he came to learn what happened to the Franklin expedition. And he actually bought, the Inuit had some items from the expedition, like forks, and I think he found a cap and things like that from the sailors. And the Inuit told him they all died, some of them quite from starvation, some of them from other reasons. But the other thing they told him was when some of the sailors of the expedition were so hungry that the Inuit had found evidence of cannibalism. So John Ray goes back to London, speaks to Lady Franklin, and tells her this. and also doesn't omit the part about cannibalism. He also speaks to the Admiralty and gives them the same report, and that gets leaked to the papers. And Lady Franklin was, she was just shocked. She was very, very upset because she was afraid that this was going to tarnish her husband's reputation, even though Franklin had died pretty early in the expedition, and he certainly hadn't. He hadn't taken part in any cannibalism, but she was very, very upset, and she went to Dickens, and she told him that this could not be. Members of the Royal Navy could not be indulging in cannibalism. It just wasn't done. It's impossible to believe that. This is scurrilous, and so on. And Dickens, of course, agreed. And so Dickens wrote a two-part long essay. Basically, he damns John Ray with faint praise. And basically what he says is that it is, how could somebody like John Ray have believed the words of ignorant savages, meaning the Inuit, and it didn't make sense that Englishmen would have eaten the remains of other Englishmen. He also was denied a knighthood, which, as someone who had discovered what looks like the last link to the Northwest Passage, he certainly deserved. And he basically fell into obscurity. And I think largely that's Dickens doing, because Dickens was such an effective pamphleteer. So what interests me in this story is not just that Dickens was quite capable of ruining someone's reputation, as he did with John. I mean, Dickens also suggested that the Inuit had killed the members of the Franklin expedition. This is based on absolutely nothing, right? But then what interested me is, why were people so outraged at the very notion of cannibalism? It's not as if, and Dickens himself, in almost every single novel, there are jokes about eating parts of the human body. So how do those two things come together? The notion of Dickens's fascination with cannibalism and the fact that he did not think twice about ruining the reputation of a man on the basis of nothing, really. So that's basically what I've been working on.
Thanks, Goldie. That was really interesting, and there was a lot in there that I didn't know, especially about Dickens not liking noise and being kind of a neat freak. I didn't know that, and it makes me wonder how he would do in this moment. Parents that are coping with suddenly having a house full of noisy children that they have to homeschool. I imagine maybe he wouldn't do so well with that from what you said. But your answer also showed there's still so much to explore just in Dickens. But I know he's not your only interest in the 19th century. I know you do other work on 19th century literature. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about other work that you're working on from that period.
The other thing I'm working on is, I've always been interested in dance. And so I've been researching some of there is dance in every single Victorian novel, practically, and even pre-Victorian with Jane Austen. And the reason is obvious, right? It was such a major social event for in the 19th century, was a way of furthering courtship. And but there are other aspects to it that I also thought was very interesting. For instance, nationalism, what kind of dances you were dancing at the balls made a difference, and actually said things. And some of the writers use it as a metaphor. The best example is actually Jane Austen, who uses dance as a metaphor for a society, how society is set up, right, with head couple and for couples further down, and everything is orderly and everybody knows their place and everybody knows what they're supposed to do. And she also uses dance as a way of allowing her characters to speak, because not all of them are dancing at the same time. And also a way of judging character. In Emma, there are a number of wonderful scenes where the heroine, Emma, judges how well who people are by how well they dance. And actually Jane Austen, that comes up in a number of the novels. So dance by itself, the most obvious reason it's there in all the novels is as for courtship purposes, but it also played a much larger role, I think, and some of the novelists really exploited its ability, the dance's ability to say more than just as a way of using it for courtship. And George Eliot in particular sets up a kind of dichotomy between English country dancing and the dances that were becoming popular in the middle of the century, like that were invaded from Europe, the waltz and the polka in particular, which Queen Victoria loved, and all of those dances. So it becomes a way of also talking about nationalism. George Eliot uses it as a way of describing good English stock, for instance, are the ones who dance English country dances, as opposed to those who are more effete and dance the waltz, let's say. The other thing is that the 19th century is really the period when ballet comes into its own, especially in London, and especially Giselle, which is put on in the 1840s and really starts a craze for ballet. And ballet became the most popular entertainment, theatrical entertainment. And ballet is also the reason that some of these other dances seeped into the balls. In ballets, you very often get national dances, and they were picked up by people for as ballroom dances. And of course, there's a whole culture of going to learn how to do all these dances. And the other interesting thing that I found is I think today we associate dance with women primarily, and even ballet certainly with women. And that was not true in the 19th century. In the 19th century, you had men who were required to learn how to dance. They went to school to learn how to dance, and it was tied up with virility. And certainly Jane Austen uses that as a measure of virility as well. So, and there's a lot of dancing in Dickens. What I was saying before about his love of writing about mobs. There's an extraordinary dance in A Tale of Two Cities, Le Carmagnole, which the revolutionaries dance, and it's quite horrifying. It's frightening because they are almost out of control, but they're dancing. So I think dance as a metaphor for Victorian novels, 19th century novels, it has a lot of possible ramifications. And I think it's very interesting to look at it.
Great, thanks. Your comments there on dance being connected to ideas of the nation or nationalism kind of leads me a little bit into my next question for you, because obviously one of your areas of research is quite far removed from Dickens, and it's Yiddish and Yiddish literature. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what you've been working on lately in that particular area.
Well, I just, as a way of melding Dickens and Yiddish, I just, this is the 150th anniversary of Dickens's death, and one of the major Jewish publications in New York, The Forward, just published an article about, based on my essay about translations of Dickens into Yiddish, because Dickens was one of the most popular non-Jewish writers among Yiddish-speaking Jews in Eastern Europe. So the two are not that far apart. But Yiddish literature is primarily a 20th century phenomenon, and Dickens obviously died in 1870. But he was revered by almost all the great Yiddish writers, and in very interesting ways. The fact that Oliver Twist was translated about 6-7 times into Yiddish is that was a shock to me, because Oliver Twist has this very anti-Semitic portrait of Fagin. And I really wondered why, and my speculation is that because when Fagin and all the other characters in Oliver Twist are speaking Yiddish, they are sort of Judaized, all of them. And so the otherness of Fagin is less obvious. So that was one thing I was working on. But aside from that, I do a lot of translations, mostly of my mother's work. My mother is a Yiddish writer. Her name was Chava Rosenfarb. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I just published a book of her essays. And I continue to work on her. She left a lot of things untranslated when she died, and so I continued to work on that. And I've also done translations of some of the other Yiddish writers, and written some critical articles about them. But I don't think that I don't know how well known these writers would be, so I won't say anything more about them.
Thanks, Goldie. So you've mentioned that you've done a lot of work recently on translation, and obviously some of that is because of it being your mother's work, kind of ties in a little bit, I think, to some of the things you were saying earlier about Dickens and family. So I would imagine that's one of the reasons, obviously, why your translation work is important to you. But why else is it so important? Could you maybe give say a few words about why your translation work specifically is important, or maybe other observations you made about the importance of translation?
I think translation is really important for a language like Yiddish, which had, before the Second World War, had an enormous, I think about 11 million speakers, readers. It was a major language. And nowadays, it's for a number of historical reasons, it's not spoken by that many people. And the result is that, especially for the literature, and there's a lot, very rich literature, that's in great danger of passing into oblivion unless it's translated. I mean, so translating in general, I think, is a very important activity, because it allows people who don't speak a language to read what has been written in that language, and it sort of broadens all our horizons in that sense. But with Yiddish, the added dimension to that is that it rescues a literature that very few people nowadays can read in the original. And so it's really an important activity. And of course, I translate primarily my mother, because she was a writer, and I want her to be read. That she wanted to be read. She did, she has the passage in one of her essays about how stifling it is to be writing for the desk drawer, to have no readers, and writers need readers. And so it's sort of become my mission to translate her work. I'm working now on her last novel. By last novel, I mean the only one that still hasn't been translated. And I must say, I like doing it because I feel like I'm communing with her. So she died in 2011. And when I translate her, I feel like she's still alive and that she's still talking to me. There are frustrations, though. We used to translate together. And so whenever I came across something I didn't understand, or I wanted to change, I could ask her. And obviously now I can't ask her anymore. And if I need to change something, I can't get her permission because she's gone. So from that point of view, it's frustrating. But in other ways, it really, I find it a bit of a comfort. I feel like she hasn't really died, in a sense.
So you mentioned there how your mother said, she wanted to have readers. She didn't want to just write her books and have them sit in a drawer and go unread. And obviously Dickens, of course, is a hugely popular author, and he's still read today. But I'm circling back a little bit to something I asked you right at the beginning of our talk. Do you have any sense that interest or readership of Dickens is waning, or do you think he's as relevant as he always was?
That's a good question. I would like to think that he's as relevant. Um, but I'm wondering, I teach Victorian novels. I teach 19th century novels. And I know that students, they're usually big, and students have problems with that. And most, not all, but a good number of Dickens's novels are about 1,000 pages long. So I've taught at senior levels, I've taught Dickens, but it always, when I bring in Bleak House and they see how big it is, I always get people dropping. Uh, I, I, I would like to think that Dickens and all the writers are relevant for the simple reason that they're good writers, and good writing doesn't go out of fashion. At least that's the idealistic answer. That's what I would like to believe. They tell a good story. And Dickens, what I love about him is the way he handles his prose. It's unlike anyone else. So, and I would like to think that I'm not alone in like appreciating what I appreciate about Dickens. Also, some of his plots have sort of gone into the general psyche, if I can put it that way. For instance, Great Expectations, the notion of the convict who is like a fairy godfather and gifts this little boy, the blacksmith's son, with great possibilities, right? There are parts of Dickens that I think have gone into the popular imagination, and without people necessarily having read him. Oliver Twist and the notion of the thieves and the underbelly of London life. But whether the extent to which people read him, I think he's more read than some of the other greats of the Victorian era, like George Eliot. Certainly Thackeray is hardly read anymore, as far as I can tell. And the Brontes, I think, still enjoy quite a lot of readership. But it's really hard to know. I think people's attention spans are shorter than they used to be. And I wonder if people altogether are reading as much as they used to. I know I'm not. And I think a lot of that has to do with the internet and distractions and things like that. So I would like to think that these novels are relevant for the simple reason that they are our world in embryo. Like, we come out of that 19th century world. And a lot of the issues we're dealing with today, the remnants of colonialism, for instance, Darwin, the scientific revolution, that's all from the 19th century and is incorporated in the novels of the 19th century. So in that sense, they're definitely relevant. And things like Sherlock Holmes, like the novels tell a great story. But the fact that some of these novels really require an investment of time, I wonder how whether people are willing to do that. I hope so, because I think we lose a great deal if we stop reading these writers. They definitely are important writers, and really shouldn't pass into oblivion, as I said before. And so I hope that they won't.
Thanks, Goldie. Speaking of an investment of time, I want to thank you for taking the time to answer my questions today and share some of your insights into this great literature. It's always a pleasure to hear your thoughts on this. And I also want to thank the audience for tuning in. And in these uncertain times that we're in, I just want to say that I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe. And I hope you continue to tune in and learn more about what's happening with some of the researchers here at the University of Lethbridge community. Thanks.
And thank you, Elizabeth. You're a great questioner and interviewer.